Hi, welcome to EDSC 550. This is Professor Vogel, and it is week 2. This is my instructor video. You'll be finding these on week 2, 4, 6, and 8. First, let me go over what our week will be about. This week, you'll be reading chapters 3 on implicit bias in the book. And in implicit bias, we'll be talking about and addressing prejudice, power, and personal biases. Also, you have during this week your reading and videos, managing unconscious bias, implicit bias for PSDI, and social emotional learning benefits and research. You also have your you also have 2 discussion boards for this week. Those 2 discussion board topics are due on Thursday for the initial, and by Sunday, making sure that you have responded to 2 peers and their comments. Be sure to use APA style, and also please use citation in your discussion boards. And finally, on Sunday, you have your achievement gap assignment. That assignment, just to briefly go over it, if you need more detailed information, make sure that you review my welcome video that has all of that information. You're going to use your summary data information template. And after you open that up, you're going to answer those questions, identifying who in the building can help you get data to understand your school's data story by reviewing and implementing a plan and reports and other data resources. Okay. So you're going to review your current school plan, and then you're going to use the question that are on the data summary, and you can answer those questions in an APA document and include additional paragraphing, or you may also do that on a separate piece of paper. Either or is okay for this assignment. All right. Next, we have and that concludes what we'll be doing for chapters for week 2, assignments that are due for week 2. I have a quick important information that I'll be sharing with you on chapter 3, and I'll be sharing my screen with you. To go over the information. All right. So this week, we're talking about implicit bias, a disconnection between intention and outcome. So historically, the systems were created for whites only and purposely marginalized people of color, creating a system of white privilege. We talked about and heard the video last week on white privilege. We must consistently interrupt the privilege in order to counteract its unearned advantages. And because we live within this system of white privilege, watching TV that perpetuates white privilege, seeing ads that can constantly remind us that white people are the most beautiful and inviolable, and see the values of white culture held above all others. We all have a bias against people of color. So, what is the definition of bias in racism? So, bias is basically a natural inclination against an idea or an object, group, or individual. It's often learned and is highly dependent on variables like person's socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, education, background, etc. At the individual level, bias can negatively impact someone's personal and professional relationships. At the societal level, it can lead to unfair persecution of a group, such as the Holocaust and slavery. So, again, the important parts of biases, we are going to have them. We can't stop them from occurring. But what we do need to do is make sure that after that situation has occurred, how do we react to our biases? Do we exclude groups? Do we create unfairness and persecution to other groups? That's what we want to check within ourselves and make sure that those things are not occurring. Racism is defined as an ideology of racial domination in which the presumed biological or cultural superiority of one or more racial groups is used to justify or prescribe the inferior treatment or social position of another group. Okay. So, um, with that domination, we are considering that one race is higher than another. And that is what the white privilege kind of discusses, that there seems to be a sense of domination over that particular group of people, um, in reference to all others, here in the United States and other places. Okay. So, racism can occur on four different levels: your personal, which is your private beliefs, prejudice, and ideas that individuals have; your interpersonal, the expression of racism between individuals; the institutional, the discriminatory treatment, policies, practices within organizations and institutions. And this is what we're fighting for our school as a school counselor. We're fighting and advocating on behalf of all of our students in this institutionalized environment to ensure that each one of our students has an opportunity to access as much of the opportunities that are available to them in our educational system. The structural a system in which public policies, institutions, practices, and other norms perpetuate racial group inequalities. So the book talks a lot about what students of color have achieved at significantly lower rates than white students, and but this information is false. That as of 2013, the average reading score for eighth grade Black students from a middle class household was exactly the same as white students from a household um, eligible for free and reduced lunch. So 78% of African American people in the United States don't live in poverty, even though the vast majority of African American friends, students, and colleagues are not living in poverty. There is an often a false association between poverty and being Black. And when we reflect on our beliefs about our lower achievement, we may realize that there are assumptions made that are not factual and supported by data. We need to stop blaming socio and economic status on achievement. When achievement is not accessible to Black students the way it is for white students, regardless of economics, involvement, or attitude. And another thing that the book brought up is, how parents are raised, parental involvement, and other attitudes. So our role as a school counselor is we have specific training, and that's what this course is about, giving you that training to recognize the signs and biases that can harm students and impede our nation from reaching its potential, which is including achievement gaps, opportunity and attainment, disproportionate rates of discipline and suspension for students of color, lower attendance rates, self-destructive behaviors such as acting out, withdrawals, non-participation of class activities, gatekeeping of the underrepresented students and access to and placement in rigorous curriculums, such as advanced placement or international baccalaureate, IB, and lower participation of underrepresented groups participating in higher education. So, how can school counselors address racism and bias through school counseling programs? They can create a sense of belonging in the school environment for all students. They can recognize and respond to racism and bias. They can just demonstrate empathy for students different from themselves. And then they can learn to create positive relationships with students different from themselves. We can learn appropriate communication skills, create positive and supportive relationships with other students and adults, and feel comfortable to identify or share problems with adults who support success. So, as we continue to address racism and bias as a counselor, we need to demonstrate advocacy skills and abilities to assert self when experiencing or witnessing racism or bias. We need to understand our own unconscious biases. We need to navigate systems of oppression and injustice. And then we need to enhance the cultural competencies and facilities and facilitate cultural awareness. And this is that typical, not typical, but this is the common picture that many people see on the difference between equality, equity, and reality. And this is what we need to keep in mind as we're working with our vast, diverse populations in as a school counselor. Equity is when we give everybody the exact same thing, and we expect everyone to be able to access that. An example of that is we give the test to someone and we expect, if it's paper and pencil, we expect everybody to achieve with paper and pencil, not recognizing that we have students with disability who struggle to get their thoughts out with paper and pencil. So perhaps a computer kind of helps them to address their ideas and flow more freely. So giving them that access and giving the option between paper and pencil with a writing assignment versus as well as a computer as a means to get the information out. That is now moving towards equity because this person needs this item in order to have that equal playing field to be able to take the test and do their best on the test. And then we have the picture of reality. We know that what society looks like today. And we know that many people have higher advantages. And there are several people that don't have any advantages. And so we need to make sure that we in the school and as school counselors are creating the middle picture of equity. So as we continue to work to end racism and bias we can do this through collaboration such as teaming with our partners and families, educators, businesses, and communities, and focus on anti-racism and bias. We need to serve on school district community committees and focus on anti-racism and bias. We need to present at workshops to parents on how to support and encourage appropriate student behavior. We need to create a community partnership that focuses on anti-racism and bias. And we need to work with administrators, families, community members to organize um, immediate and follow-up interventions in response to crisis. And when students need extended beyond short-term services of counselings, we need to refer victims of racism and bias to schools or community resources that support victim rights and healing the damage. We need to refer perpetrators of racism to schools or community resources that address racism and bias and teach appropriate anti-racist and anti-bias behaviors. We need to create a system of change. We need to identify sources of power and authority formal and informal leadership, collect and report data that exposes those inequitable outcomes, such as achievement gaps, opportunities and attainments, disproportionality rates of discipline and suspension for students of color, and lower attendance rates. So as of August 2020, there have been over 20 states that's introduced a bill to ban critical race theory and discussions about racism in public school. So the critical race theory is a theoretical framework that provides educational research and policymakers and practitioners with critical lenses to deconstruct oppressive policies and practices to construct more emancipatory systems for racial equity and justice. So, how can we talk about racism in the classroom? And for us, it would be in groups. How do we go about, um, addressing this if we have a racial situation on our campus? Well, first, we need to set up a safe and respectful classroom environment. And when we do that, we need to make sure that everybody feels welcomed and everybody has an opportunity to express their opinions without feeling as if their opinions don't matter. Consider the racial composition of our class. We need to look at everyone in the class. Sometimes we focus on just majorities, and we have a diverse classroom where there's many different people from different backgrounds. So we need to make sure that everybody has a voice. We have to define terms, defining terms like what this means and what that means. As an elementary school counselor, what I hear most frequently today is a lot of she's being racist, he's being racist, because they're getting information from social media, from the news, but they're not applying it appropriately. They understand now if a person uses a word, and not a derogatory word, but calls you and says, you're Hawaiian, then someone says, oh, you're being racist. That's for lack of definition of terms. They're not aware of it's okay for us to be proud of our culture and define ourselves within the group that we identify with. But they feel like we can't say it at all because if we say it, that's being racist. Connect the past with the present, understanding that, you know, there's a history here, and that history has deep seated feelings and emotion behind it, and that we can't ignore it because it's been passed on. And then some of us are getting that same experience here in the present. And so sometimes our children feel that, oh, that was the past. That doesn't happen today. It may not have happened to you yet, but it is happening. And it's happening to many people. So we need to connect the past with the present. We need to understand perspectives, that there are a variety of perspectives, and that I can be African American and I can sit next to three other African Americans. We can all be friends and have different perspectives. Thinking critically about the media. What's the saying today that if it's not on social media, it didn't really happen? Well, that's where the media today is not really giving us the information the way we need it, and in as factual of a way as possible. So we have to really, really teach our children about our sources. Are they a really reliable source? Because everyone has access to it. Anyone can publish on it, but is it reliable? Is it factual? And then talk about structural racism and white privilege, why it exists. What is it? Defining those terms and helping them to understand. We need to encourage empathy that, we understand how it feels. We don't have to have, we don't necessarily, or we may not have experienced exactly what you experienced. But if you tell me that made me feel humiliated, wow, I can understand humiliation. I've been humiliated before. I've been disappointed before. So, and I know how that feels, even though it's not the exact same situation. And we need to inspire hope and activism. So here's some thoughts that came and questions that were asked at the end of the chapter 3, that we need to make sure as school counselors that we're treating students with respect and dignity. And here's some questions that we can ask ourselves about the campus that we're serving. How do staff members speak to the students? We've had some staff members that, don't use the most positive words. Do they treat all the students with respect? You have your favorites, and sometimes we have to check ourselves. Our favorites, students that look like us, or are we diverse and we talk to everyone the same, Are some students treated with more respect and dignity than others? And how do students treat each other? So that's a point that we need to address. And are some students respected and others disregarded? That is extremely important. The school counseling program needs to advocate and affirm all students from diverse populations. Do you actively seek to overcome the barriers for your diverse students? Do you disaggregate data by race, socioeconomics, status, gender, disabilities, English language learners, and other subgroups that ensure that all your students are successful? And would you take stakeholders, and would your stakeholders identify you as a social justice advocate? The ethical counselor is going to think about these questions. Do you have questions about and collaborate with other staff members? Do you have questions about the best way to serve some of your groups of students? We can't all identify with each and every group. And when we're trying to serve them, how can we best serve them? Maybe we need to collaborate with other individuals. Do you self-reflect to ensure that you have the skills needed when working with the students who are different than us? And the counselors needs to purposefully improve educational services for the underserved populations. Do we disaggregate data for historically underserved students to ensure that they have access to all educational services? Do we disaggregate higher level courses such as AP, AIG to determine if any subgroups are underserved? And do we advocate for placement practices for advanced coursework and intervention services that ensure the right students are selected? All right, so again, this is the picture of equality, equity, and then liberation. Once we are free and everyone is really there, then we will be able to remove all the barriers and supports because they're no longer needed in the liberation picture, and inequity has been addressed. So that is our goal. Thank you guys and have a wonderful week.